We are really lucky to have two expert researchers join us. Lucrecia Santibáñez, who's from the Claremont Graduate University, is with us this morning, as well as Ilana Mlansky from the University of Oregon. So we brought sunshine for you, just to be sure. And if you go on the link for the Getting Down to Facts reports, you can also download their technical reports, which are excellent sources of information. And Lucrecia talks a lot about teacher credential requirements in California and how to address their needs. And Ilana's paper is about state policies to advance English learners' experiences and outcomes in California. So while you have the brief that summarizes that today, you might be interested in getting down to more facts at that website. So we are going to start this morning. Okay. It's not advancing. Here we go. I don't know why it's not showing up there.
What if you hit escape and get out of that slide?
Well, I just told Control Alt.
Oh, there you
Oh,
are.
there you go.
Oh, okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Okay.
Third time's a charm. So we are not going to start with Ilana, though, are we?
Yes,
yes.
Oh, we are. You
It's
will.
already set up.
Okay, Ilana
Yes.
is going to start. She has about 10 or 12 minutes to go over her information, and
Got
then
my-
we'll switch over to Lucrecia. So help me welcome.
It's really great to be here. Usually I'm working on my PowerPoints until about 5 minutes before I present, and I couldn't do that this week because we needed to send our PowerPoints off at the end of last week. And so you will notice there is a missing apostrophe on my title page, and I apologize for that. That's the kind of thing I'm usually catching a few minutes before my sessions start. But I'm really excited to be here. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Oregon, but from Oakland, and did my graduate work at Stanford, so I'm sort of a recent Oregon transplant, and California is my home. So I'm going to be presenting basically a very quick overview, since we only have about 10 or 12 minutes, of the technical report that I wrote. And basically the general idea of this technical report was to present a policy framework for California English learner education policy. And it wasn't an empirical report. Lucrecia will be presenting a lot of empirical work coming up next. This was more of a synthesis of the existing research base to identify key policy areas and understand what the research base says in terms of pointing us in a direction forward for California. So I'm gonna, you'll see that I'll show you the policy framework. There are 9 key policy areas that I write about, and I'm only gonna talk about 3 of them here today, and I'm only gonna talk about them pretty briefly, but I hope that you'll have an opportunity to look at the technical report more closely if you're interested in learning about the other 6. So first of all, this idea of a policy framework was really motivated by a lot of the work that California is already doing. And in particular, in 2017, the State Board adopted the California EL Roadmap. And that outlines 4 principles for English learner education at the state level. And it really builds off a lot of the work that Susanna was talking about that California has been doing with the local control funding formula, the ELA, ELD curricular framework, the new global California 2030 initiative in terms of bilingualism. So really trying to capitalize off of a lot of work that California is already doing and sort of harness that into an overarching policy framework. So this is, it looks like my PowerPoint got a little bit funny. You know how sometimes when you send a PowerPoint things get a little bit off kilter, but good enough. This is the policy framework. Actually, in the technical report, what we do is I situate the 9 policy areas within the 4 principles of the roadmap. Here I'm showing it a little bit differently, where there's just 3 principles. The first is understanding student needs and assets. The second is accessible, high-quality instruction. And the third is system conditions. Those are the 3 principles underlying this sort of comprehensive state English learner policy framework that I'm putting forward. And I'll motivate this by saying that, you know, states have an incredibly important role to play with regard to English learner education. They're the primary governing body, obviously, in the U.S., tasked with public education, and therefore they have a really important a role to play in terms of envisioning, structuring, and overseeing the education of English learners in the state. California also is home to one of 3 English learners in the country. It has both the highest number of English learners in the country as well as the highest proportion of students who are English learners in the country. It also has an enormous amount, you know, oftentimes we talk about current English learners, but it's really important to think of the entire subgroup, any student who enters school as an English learner, and we call this group ever ELs, students who are ever classified as an English learner. And that's 38% of the California K-12 population. It's an enormous proportion of our students. So it's a really important population here and deserves not to be, as we were just saying with Lucrecia, that deserves not to be sort of pushed to the side and thought of as some sort of addendum, but really center stage in terms of thinking about California policy. And, you know, Susanna talked about some of the big achievement gaps that English learners are facing, and I think that's really important to acknowledge and work to change. I also think it's really important to build off of build and recognize the immense strengths that California's English learners have. We oftentimes focus on achievement gaps and forget to think about how these students are really, in so many ways, the lifeblood of moving the state forward. They're important for our economy, our identity, our well-being as a state. So the framework is really also rooted in that as a sort of principle. So these are the 3 key policy areas that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. The first is addressing the diversity in skills and needs of the English learner population. So it's interesting that you guys picked that one as sort of your in the poll, the one that was most interesting to you or most important to you. The second is about English learners' access to core content. And the third is about education funding for English learners. So those are the 3 that I'll talk about today. And in the report, the research questions that I look at are, what does research suggest are pressing policy areas regarding English learner education in California? And for each of these policy areas, what's the status of English learner policy in the state? And what does the research base suggest might support moving that policy base forward? I'm not going to be able to talk about all of that today. Really what I'm going to focus on, what is the policy relevant research base in each area, and what are some of the policy implications of each of these 3. The first is addressing diversity in the skills and needs of English learners. So historically, and I think Lucrecia is going to talk about this a little bit as well, historically English learner policy has clustered all English learners together, assuming that English learners have similar characteristics and similar needs. And there's really a growing movement away from that, and the California English Learner Roadmap acknowledges that, and I think that's a really important step that the roadmap takes. The roadmap says there's no universal EL profile and no one-size-fits-all approach. And so I want to talk about, I think it's important to understand that, of course, every student who's classified as an English learner has very unique needs and skills and assets, but I want to talk about 3 subgroups in particular. So English learners with disabilities, newcomer students, and long-term ELs. So with English learners with disabilities, there's 3 sort of areas of policy relevant research that I think are particularly important. The first has to do with identification of English learners with disabilities. The second is appropriate service provision, and the third is timely and appropriate exit. So I'll just talk really briefly about each of those. So in terms of appropriate identification, there's a lot of there's a lack of skilled individuals to be able to separate what are the needs of English learners that have to do with language proficiency versus disability identification. Our assessments are also relatively biased because our assessments are primarily in English when we're trying to identify a disability, and it's again there can be confusion over English proficiency and disability. As a result, there's a lot of disproportionality in identification. What we notice is that there tends to be under-identification of English learners early on into disability categories, and later on over-identification in particular subgroups, disability categories. So second are barriers that have to do with service provision, and just very briefly, it's a real struggle for districts and schools to try to figure out, okay, how do I serve this student in terms of their needs as an English learner, and how do I serve this student in terms of their needs as a student with a disability? And they're sort of never the twain shall meet. There's really, these are two sort of siloed kinds of services. And oftentimes, English learners will even be excluded from particular, English learners with disabilities will be excluded from particular kinds of programs, such as bilingual education, because there's an assumption that they won't necessarily benefit or be able to participate fully. And then finally, there's a real struggle with regard to exiting students. And that's because many places do not have appropriate accommodations in place for reclassification criteria, and English learners with disabilities are unable to meet those reclassification criteria, and so you have sort of a bottleneck as you get into the secondary school, as you get into higher grades. So those are some of the big challenges and sort of policy relevant needs of English learners with disabilities. The second group, briefly, is newcomers. Newcomers have a much broader range of backgrounds than English learners on average. In a recent study that looked at home language, for instance, in 2 states, not California, 80% of English learners had Spanish as a home language, but 50% of newcomer students had Spanish as a home language. So that's just indicative of the broader range of backgrounds among newcomers. Newcomers also have a really broad range of backgrounds in terms of coming with really different kinds of needs. Some are coming with really, they've been in school all along, they have high levels of literacy in their home language, and some are really not. Some are coming out of refugee camps, some have not had any schooling at all, or have large interrupted gaps in their prior schooling, and so they have needs that relate to economic needs, health needs, psychological needs, academic needs. So the population of newcomers, which is coming in obviously at every grade level, is just a much broader range of needs, and sometimes much more acute. One thing to keep in mind, though, about newcomers is that recent evidence points to the fact that they grow really fast in their first years here, so it's a real window of opportunity. And then finally, very briefly, long-term English learners, which is a specific definition in California, as you guys probably all know, but has to do with students that have been classified as English learners for 6 or more years. And this is about 7 to 8% of K-12, 7 to 8% of English learners in the secondary school grades. And one of the things that's important to think about in terms of long-term English learners is we identify the student. But a lot of research points to that it's not the student that should be labeled, but it's the barriers in terms of that they've faced in terms of their education thus far that has created this situation where they've been classified as a long-term English learner. And some of these barriers have to do with inconsistent services, complex reclassification criteria, and also, a lot of long-term English learners are also dually classified with special education. So again, these barriers in terms of reclassification, I want to get this back on so I don't take too long. Okay, I'm just going to take another few minutes. So policy implications of this. Obviously, no one-size-fits-all model. In terms of English learners with disabilities, there's important policy implications regarding having the staffing and the assessments necessary to have appropriate and timely identification, making sure that dually classified students have access to the appropriate services for both of their sets of needs, and that we have appropriate accommodations in place that make exiting English learner status accessible to these students. In terms of newcomers, there's needs regarding having wraparound services so that their needs, their economic needs, their health needs, their psychological needs are met. and also that we're extending access for them, because oftentimes with newcomers there's a real pattern of segregation out of mainstream services, and so we need to have ways of balancing segregation with integration or separation with integration. And finally, long-term English learners, simplifying reclassification criteria and improving their access to services so that they can meet those reclassification criteria. Okay, second is access to core content, and these latter two are a little bit shorter than the first one. But this is one that a lot of my work has to do with, and is something that I think is really critical. And that's that we know, both the state has taken a stand, and we know in terms of research that it's important for English learners to have simultaneous access to both English language development instruction and core content instruction. And yet what we find is that access to English language development instruction is often prioritized over core content instruction. And English learners tend to be placed into lower track classes, lower level classes, but also fewer core content area classes overall. So they face exclusion, outright exclusion from, for instance, English language arts classes or math classes or science classes. And this leads to lower achievement, slower reclassification, particularly right now because of the inclusion of academic criteria in reclassification, and barriers towards graduation. The last one I want to,
Oops.
Did I do something?
Great, I'm the last person in the world that can do that. Just control.
Just the control,
D,
maybe
right,
what you
follow.
did before.
Okay.
There you are. Excellent.
Oh, great. I probably touched something.
Thank you.
The last point is just that simply placing English learners into core content classes or into the same level of core content classes isn't going to be sufficient, right? Because we need to have teachers that are trained to be successful educators of English learners within mainstream environments, or else we run the risk, which research has shown, that students can fail those classes, repeat those classes, or simply be sort of be exposed to inferior content within the same classroom as their peers. Yeah, so the policy implications here, it's really important to have full access to core content as soon as possible, and to make sure that it's linguistically accessible. And sometimes you will need to give English learners extra time, because they need to have both their English language development instruction and their access to core content. So oftentimes, English learners need extra instructional time. That it's important for us to think about course level, not just whether a student is enrolled, but the level at which they're enrolled. So examine tracking practices, access to A through G classes, access to GATE, or gifted and talented, AP, etc. Also, it's important to think about when students are in sheltered classes, what kind of access to content do they have within that sheltered environment. And finally, making sure that teachers have the skills and the materials in order to be successful educators for English learners within core content classes. And finally, just very briefly, English learner education funding. And Susanna spoke some about this in the plenary just now. But basically, the overarching point here is that equalizing access and opportunity for English learners costs extra money. There's a lot of associated expenses: teacher preparation, having the right curriculum, having unbiased assessments, developing bilingual programs, implementing those programs, training bilingual teachers, supporting extra time, in the school day or in the summer, etc. So it costs money. We also know that we don't know exactly, there's sort of disagreements within the research base about how much extra money, but we do know that it depends. It depends on that, as we started with, that the skills and needs of English learners are diverse. Well, that also is associated with different kinds of expenses. So both the characteristics of students themselves mean that there's different costs associated, but also for different districts and schools that have different different programs already set up, or the size of them, or the pace at which the English learner population is growing, etc. So how much it costs to equalize access and opportunity depends. Finally, it's really important that funds for English learner education actually reach students that are classified as English learners, and that they're used in ways that actually benefit students. And so that speaks to these policy implications, which is that there's a growing understanding or research base that under local control funding formula and the LCAP plans, that there's not a lot of accountability that districts are actually putting their supplemental and concentration grant funds towards the education of English learners specifically, and also within LCAP plans that there's sufficient planning and thinking through of what are the funding needs associated with their English learners and how are they going to spend those funds. So regulation and monitoring of funds is important, district and school planning is important, and as Susanna mentioned, particularly in districts that do not get a concentration grant, the funding for English learners is really pretty low compared to a lot of other states and low in terms of needs. So that is it. This is Lucrecia and my policy brief, which I think you guys all got, and that's the technical report. So hope you can go and check those out for more details. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilana. All right. So I want to start thanking you for being here. Thanks for coming. Gracias por venir. I want to acknowledge my co-author, Christine Snyder, who's a graduate student at Claremont Graduate University, who co-authored the brief with me. And I wanted to, before I jump into talking about teachers, I'm going to tie it back to what Ilana just mentioned. You know, English learners are a very vulnerable population, as all of you know. And I want to underscore what Ilana said about them not being an addendum. It is a fifth, almost a quarter of the population, of the student population in California. And so their success is necessary if California is ever going to strive to close achievement gaps and reach a more equitable place. And they're vulnerable in ways that may be hard for us in this room to affect. They're made vulnerable by poverty, immigration status, things that are sort of maybe not necessary things that we can move the needle on. But as Ilana just kind of recounted, they're also unfortunately made vulnerable by our own policies. And I think that is the point that I'm hoping we can come out of this room kind of having thought through. Where can we actually affect some change? Because restricting content, you know, are things that are sort of within the purview of education policymaking, improving assessments, improving designation, classification, adequate funding. And one of the things that motivated mine and Christine's study was to look at teachers. Because we know that teachers are the most important school level factor, that a good teacher can get any student to learn and succeed, given that the teacher has the right resources and support. Now, teachers are not magicians. They cannot, you know, just pull it out of a hat and make everyone succeed as much as we wanted to. So our motivating question was just to try to understand if teachers in California, because can expect to have English learners in the classrooms, and basically all teachers in California can expect to have an English learner in their classroom, how can they be best prepared? Now, to address, especially after the passage in 1997 of Proposition 228, which outlawed prohibited bilingual education, there were several major reforms in teacher preparation. And perhaps one of the most important ones was this embedded EL authorization. So after 2004, every newly credentialed teacher in California comes out with an EL authorization that is embedded in their credentials. So they don't need to go get separate training because the assumption is that they have been trained. So it's a very difficult research, sort of technical question to understand whether that is true or not, because we would have to tie it back to students, and we would have to do things that unfortunately in California, if you read the data brief, are impossible because it's very hard to link teachers to students. So what we try to do is just to kind of start a step back and see what is actually being given as part of teacher credentialing process. Are ELs, are English learners sort of prevalent? Are they addressed in credential requirements, and how are they addressed? And the reason this is a very pressing question is because English learners are actually more likely than non-English learners to be taught by new teachers. They are in schools, they happen to be in schools, and this is actually data from California Department of Education, where more teachers are new. So the fact that these teachers are coming out of these programs with who may or may not be adequately prepared is actually a really important question. They're also, as Linda Darling-Hammond and Carter Thomas found in their paper, are more likely to be taught by teachers with emergency style units. There's also sort of a puzzle, when you look at the data, because if you ask teachers coming out of credential programs, like the California Teaching Credentialing Commission issues these surveys, if you ask them, do you feel prepared to teach English learners? The vast majority say they are. They're super prepared. They're very well prepared. And this sort of initial enthusiasm starts to kind of go down. After they've been out, in their induction program, after they've been in the classroom for a year, that proportion is starting to go down because they're sort of realizing, wait a minute, this is really difficult stuff. And if you ask teachers who've been in the classroom post-clear credential, like the first 5 years, this is actually a survey that I conducted with Patricia Gandara out of UCLA, only LAUSD teachers, it goes way down to about 50%. So they're realizing this is very difficult to do. And this is probably not what I was trained for when I was going through my teacher preparation program. So our overarching finding was that first of all, teachers of English learners do need specialized knowledge. And this may sound sort of like obvious to us, but there is still in the scholarly literature this idea that it's just good teaching. That's all you need, it's just good teaching. And we actually find that there is an evidence base. It's not huge, actually, but there's a small, rigorous body of evidence that suggests teachers of English learners do need a certain special skills and dispositions to work with this population. And new teachers in California receive some of this training in their credential program, but they are not adequately prepared to actually effectively teach ELs once they're in the classroom. And I'll show you one in a minute. I don't want to go. I have my stop at 11:25, so I have 7 more minutes to go. All right, so research questions. Our first question was sort of kind of just a very overarching question. To what extent is the teaching of ELs addressed by credential requirements? And then the second one was a bit more nuanced. To what extent does this process actually requires that teachers demonstrate proficiency? So what are the assurances that teacher preparation programs have that their teachers that are coming out of these programs can effectively teach English learners? It was a qualitative study because of the data limitations. We actually did a case study with a small sample of teachers and induction providers in one Southern California teacher preparation program, and we reviewed a bunch of the CalTPAs, teaching performance expectations, a lot of the credential documents. Okay. So the literature tells us that the sort of the key practices for teachers of ELs can be lumped into these 3 buckets. So you have EL-specific scaffolds. So the teachers of EL should know something about use of primary language, how to facilitate English language production, things that are kind of related to language objectives and EL-specific observable scaffolds. Then you have EL-specific expertise in terms of really linguistics and language. And actually, the preliminary credential focuses a lot on this aspect. There's some about differentiation, tailoring, adapting the curriculum, et cetera. And then you have EL-specific orientations, which are very important for teachers to generate inclusive classrooms, and how to have an asset orientation, an equity orientation, how to involve parents, how to engage parents, etc. Okay, so the first research question, we found actually that yes, teaching English learners is strongly emphasized in the preliminary program. So if you look at the documents of the preliminary credential, ELs are a prevalent theme. They're all over there. Induction, much less so. It is actually, there's no induction standard that's solely focused on ELs. I'll say more about that in a second. And then the research question too, this was actually, it's the more complex answer, because to gain a credential, to come out of the induction process with your clear, credential, which means your permanent credential, you actually don't really need to show a lot of proficiency teaching ELs. You can come out of that program having very limited evidence or shown very limited evidence that you can effectively teach ELs. Let me talk about why that is the case. So in preliminary, there's a lot of it, and there are in the Cal. We looked at the Cal TPA teaching performance assessment. There are other exams, but basically you have to show that you can design a lesson plan with differentiated instruction. There's some written sort of theoretical tasks that ask teachers to show, and then during their student practice, they have to teach in a classroom with at least one EL. Now, that goes back to our initial point about one size fits all, and you can see, and we go in a lot of detail in our report about this, how it has to be one EL, as if any EL sort of is a good representation for everyone else. And one of the first things that teachers encounter within the classroom, and they have English learners at different levels of proficiency, is that it is very complicated to try to tailor a lesson for an English learner who's at level 1 and an English learner who's at level 4. And so that's sort of the first thing that hits them, because they don't usually encounter that in preliminary, because they're always focusing on just one EL. Now, induction is very personalized. If any of you are teachers and have done this, you can know that you have your individualized learning plan, and you elect to focus on the things that you feel you need the most as a teacher. And together with your coach, you're going to basically structure your induction based on that focus. And it does not, and so English learners may not be that focused. It doesn't have to be that focused. A lot of these teachers are focusing on classroom management, they're focusing on new techniques. I'll give you an example of one of the things that our induction teachers focused on. This was sort of their focus of their individualized learning plan. So one teacher wanted to do small group interactions, so this is something she wanted to focus on, empowering students, brain breaks, I'm not quite sure what that means, innovative curriculum and experiences, so they were trying to really innovate with the curriculum, they were trying to do activities. But none of these are necessarily focused on, how do I differentiate a lesson when I have 3 levels of English learners together with non-English learners in my own class. And so what ends up happening is that teachers go through induction and they're taking in a lot, because they're new teachers, they're struggling, they're learning a lot of different things. And the English learner, when we interviewed them, they were sort of cognizant that they were not focusing on them, but they just didn't think they had enough bandwidth at that point in their lives to do everything. The other thing with induction that sort of prevents teachers from demonstrating this proficiency is that teachers are only required to show self-assessed growth. So you say, I think I'm at a 2 on this, and I want to be at a 3. I'm emerging in competence, and I want to be a whatever. But you may not get to mastery in any of these proficiencies, because as long as you show growth, that's basically all you need to clear your credential. And also the California standards for the teaching profession, which guide induction, are very general. None of the CSTPs are specifically focused on English learners. They're about supporting all learners. So you could, even if you made this standard say your focus, you could talk about that in many, many ways, and it doesn't necessarily would mean that you would focus on English learners. The other thing we found that was kind of interesting was that there's no actual guideline or requirement for what constitutes acceptable student work, and teachers can submit a whole range of things. I'll give you a few examples. So these are a focus EL student for our induction teachers. This is a self-assessment, and this was submitted as evidence of teaching English learner. This is a kindergarten teacher, so it's a flower. This is like a worksheet, answering with well-supported sentences. This is a group assignment, so it's hard to know what was the student's contribution to the group assignment. All of this is acceptable student work. So there are very few or no external assessments of proficiency teaching ELs in induction. We found that induction does not require that coaches and program coordinators independently verify whether teachers adequately implement EL-related practices. There's some of it in accreditation. Of course, TPPs have to be accredited, so there is some sort of external checkpoint, but there's wide variation within programs in how coaches are trained to coach teachers around English learner issues, how they're monitored, supervised, etc. And as long as teachers meet all program requirements and they show some growth toward their goals, even if they're still at sort of lower levels of proficiency, they will clear their credential. Just a couple of things to finish. ELs are treated in teacher preparation as a monolithic group. There's this constant drive towards, the one EL, the focused EL student. Another kind of troubling thing is that in the program requirements for the preliminary credential, if you cannot find an English learner in the school where the student is doing their practice, they will get a recently RFEP, recently fluent class, somebody who just exited, or they would get a special education student, which is again conflating English learner with special education, which is very problematic for how teachers view English learners in the classroom. So this is the special needs. And then the other troubling thing that we found is that teachers didn't always know the English level of their EL students. It would take about a month for them to get this information about the CELT. It used to be the CELT when we did our study. And then when they got it, they just didn't quite know what to do with it. They sort of didn't quite understand what was the difference between 1, 2, 3, and 4 and what that implies for differentiation, because they've actually never done it before. This could be theoretically remedied during induction, but the process cannot guarantee that this will happen. So to conclude, teachers of the ELs need specialized knowledge, dispositions, and practices, and to a certain degree, this is recognized in the embedded EL authorization. But although teaching is a prevalent theme in preliminary and to a lesser degree in induction, the state of California has very few external assurance points where novices can demonstrate proficiency. And if you're talking about a fifth of your population, student population in this group, and most of them being, or a higher proportion of them being exposed to novice teachers, this is a real problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, 2 minutes over.
No, you did amazing. Well, then I don't need to summarize because that's my time. So that's perfect. You did a great job.
Thanks.
Thank you to both of our presenters. So it's my turn to give a brief summary, and then we'll have some table conversations and questions and answers. But one of the things that you all pointed out at the beginning is this is a large group of students, 1 in every 5 or a little bit more here in California, 1.3 million students, and they're not a homogeneous group. They come to us with many background characteristics, and we need to design our programs and our services and our credentialing practices in order to address that. Whether they're newcomers, long-term English learners, students who are dually identified for special education as well, or sometimes wrongfully identified for special education. It's the world's most expensive ESL class, I'll tell you that right now. Actually, LA Unified has more English learners than the whole state of Washington does. So just being the largest state enrolling English learners, we're a lot more than that, no matter what year of data you look for. Just lost that. And also, they noted that we have a dual obligation for serving English learners, English language proficiency, as well as academic standards. We do this simultaneously in California. This is difficult. We need to train teachers to be able to do this and support them. I would argue we need to train administrators as well. We have a lot of new administrators coming in as well. If you read the technical reports, they do talk also about the new ELD standards, how they're aligned to the ELA standards, and how we have the obligation to provide not just English language development in a class dedicated to that, but also integrated within all the content areas. Even more important, to have teachers who are coached and ready to go so they can adequately address the English needs of all English learners as well as their academic preparation. Interpreting English learner outcomes is difficult since we don't have all the data systems currently in place that we would like. But we would like to be able to look at that subgroup, including students who were ever English learners. That's 38%, you said. So we have room for improvement in this area. The EL subgroup changes over time. It's refreshed all the time. Students come in at any particular level, at any particular grade level, and then they're reclassified. So it's not the same group forever that we could measure their progress on. By the way, the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, does require a common reclassification criteria across the state, so policymakers are working towards that now that we'll have the LPAC information, the new SELT, the Son of SELT, coming up this year. So we have that to look forward to. Right now, we are in flux with that, and districts might choose different criteria depending where you look. You also talk in your papers about the lack of alignment between preschool all the way through post-secondary, and hopefully that's an area where we can focus a lot of attention as we move ahead. I am a bit optimistic with the passage of Prop 58 and the adoption of the new EL roadmap and other credentialing programs that we are going to be able to move ahead with implementing higher quality programs for our English learners. But as she pointed out, many early career teachers are teaching English learners now, and they need a lot of support to do a really effective job in that. And last but not least, we do have our new funding formula, local control funding formula, LCFF, that came in 2013, and it does bring not just funding to every student, but a little additional funding for English learners and other unduplicated populations. But we don't have a really good way right now of ensuring that those funds are adequately assigned to support the role for English learners. So I think that's a good summary, as quick as I could go. You could tell me about that afterwards if you have other opinions. But do read the technical reports, they're wonderful. So now we're going to move into a bit of discussion as they mentioned earlier in the plenary session, that we want to get from you and get your ideas as well so that we can inform folks, policymakers and influencers about where we would like to go. So at your table, we have 3 questions to consider, and then we'll have a chance to share out and have some questions and answers with our presenters as well. So the 3 questions to consider at your tables are: what stood out in the data on English learners in California? What barriers do you see standing in the way of necessary reform in this area? And what solutions could help to overcome those barriers? You might want to focus on that one a little bit more. And based on this research, what do you think should be the top priorities for the next administration and legislature? So we're going to take about 10 minutes to discuss at our tables this information, and we'll have time to share and then have some question and answer. So go ahead and talk with your table groups about any or all of these prompts, and then we'll do a brief share out.
Oh, yeah. Just trying to be quick.
Focus on the discussion. So I think that it was really excellent that the report was formatted in terms of new EL policy roadmap, and so it's
Okay, maybe we could finish that last thought at your table, and then we could come together for a brief debrief. So great. It should go on for 2 hours or longer. I know, it's a great topic. So let's come back together. And we don't have to march through here question by question, but we have 5 minutes left. Let's hear and share together a few of the thoughts that you might have or questions that you would like to pose for beyond discussion, beyond this session. But we were just saying that this session could have gone on for a couple hours and we still wouldn't be done. It's so interesting. So based on your table discussions, somewhat loosely around these topics, let's have some volunteers share out some of the thoughts that they perhaps heard around their tables. Way to kill a party. I know. I'm going to call on Jennifer. No. So any thoughts about these prompts that were particularly interesting at your table, or something you'd like to share out for the benefit of everyone here, or ask our researchers? Okay, 2 minutes ago you weren't shy at all. Oh, thank you.
First of all, I thought you did a great job summarizing.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
With respect to Lucretia and Ayana, thank you also for your presentations. I'm definitely going to dive into the information later. I've seen a little bit of it already. I guess first of all, we know that more languages is better. Even when we redesignate our students to FEP students, they outscore their English-only counterparts in FEP. So, as a presupposition, it's important to remember that. I'm chagrined that some of what we've heard today goes back to the 1970s, where you have Jane Mercer, UCR, with the system of multi-pluralistic assessment, trying to close the gap with regards to how do we assess EL kids. Can't give them the Stanford Binet. I mean, that was a day in the early 70s when we were using, I believe, the Stanford Binet. And then the Larry P. case kicked out IQ testing. But you could use things like the Lighter International Scale, which was a nonverbal test. That gave you a better sense of the information the student had. In other words, what was their knowledge base? But we still see the fact that we're not testing our kids and then testing them as they get older and putting them in special ed. You know, it's almost, to me, it's a loss. We're kind of lost still. And you still have people, like when I think of 1.3 million students of the 50 states, probably half the states have fewer than those students. For example, Colorado.
Yeah.
The great state of Colorado has 800,000 students. They almost match LA Unified. That's it. You go into Idaho, Montana, Utah, you just go all over the place. And there's the big giant states, California, New York, Texas, Florida, that have the big numbers. But that is a lot of students to be marginalized. So I guess I'm a little bit concerned that how much progress have we really made since the 70s? There were lawsuits that fought on this topic of how do we assess students who have special needs, and how do we assess those who are English learners. So that's kind of one of the big things that kind of got my mind when I sat here to listen.
I appreciate that. It is kind of like Groundhog's Day. Like, haven't we been here a lot of times in the past? But I personally feel very optimistic that it's not perfect. We've improved a lot. We would have been really happy to be where we are now 15 years ago, but it's not good enough. We have to keep getting better, don't we? And your comments about assessment are spot on. I was around in the 70s. I wasn't teaching yet, but I was around. So when they told me, well, you have 4 years of Spanish and you want to be a teacher, there's no teaching jobs unless you want to do this thing called bilingual ed. I'm like, what's that? Sign me up. It was the best decision I ever made. It was the best decision. Yes, please.
Just really briefly, I do want to recognize some of the work that California has done recently in terms of assessment, and there's probably folks in the room that know more than I do about this, but a couple of things that I think are important. One is the Spanish language arts assessment that's being developed right now. It's not right now being planned to use for accountability purposes, which is something that I think the state can think more about, but it is under development, and I think that's a real step forward. And the other thing is a language observation use protocol that's being developed as potentially part of reclassification criteria. And that's more of a formative assessment of students' language use. And so I think those are two steps forward that the state has made, and the LPAC, obviously. So those are three big things the state has done recently with regard to assessment of English learners.
Very good. We need to get you back to California. So. Okay, well, unfortunately, we're at our time limit, although we could stay here all day. And we do have one final poll. If you could go back into Slido. And based on this research, what do you think should be top priorities for the next administration and legislature? So if you can take a moment to do that before we go. And I want to thank our researchers one more time for a fabulous session.
Thank you.
And, we so appreciate your work. It's going to be very helpful for the new administration. So, and thanks to all of you for coming as well.
Great.
Thank you,
And
Jane.
these are all being recorded, so if you catch up with sessions you missed or share this session.
And all the PowerPoints will be online too, so
And
if you want to
for
review
moderating.
that more.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks a
thanks
lot.
for inviting me.
Of course.
I don't know who wrote me into it, but I'm very happy. I said, I'll be there anyway, so might as well.
Great.
Really great. So all this will be, yep. Oh, I love that.
Next is lunch downstairs. More breakouts up here.
After that. Okay. Thank you all.
Thanks.